The streets of London buzzed with energy as people from all walks of life gathered near Buckingham Palace. It was a crisp afternoon, and the air carried the excitement of a royal parade. Tourists snapped photos, children pointed at the towering guards in their iconic red tunics and bearskin hats, and locals chatted animatedly, soaking in the historic charm of the moment. Amidst this lively scene stood Jake, a man who couldn't have looked more out of place if he tried. Jake was no stranger to standing out. His leather jacket, adorned with patches that screamed rebellion, stretched over his broad frame. Dark sunglasses shielded his eyes, but his smirk said it all. He thrived on chaos. A motorcycle helmet dangled from one hand, while the other rested casually on a thick metal chain hooked to his belt loop. The chain wasn't just an accessory, it was a symbol of his attitude. Reckless, untamed, and always ready for trouble. As the parade approached, the crowd pressed closer to catch a glimpse of the royals passing by. But Jake wasn't there for the pomp or pageantry. He had wandered into the area almost by accident, his bike parked haphazardly nearby after a long ride through the city. Now, surrounded by families and tourists, he felt like a fish out of water. And when a tall, stoic royal guard stepped forward to block his path, Jake's patience wore thin. "Move," Jake muttered under his breath, his tone dripping with irritation. The guard didn't budge. Their expression remained unreadable, as though carved from stone. To Jake, this lack of reaction only fueled his frustration. Who did this person think they were? Just another cog in the machine, enforcing rules that didn't apply to someone like him, or so he believed. Feeling the weight of curious eyes on him, Jake decided to make a statement. He wanted to show everyone that he wasn't someone to be pushed around. Slowly, deliberately, he unhooked the metal chain from his belt loop. Its metallic clink echoed faintly in the background noise of the crowd. With a cocky grin, he swung the chain lazily in front of him, letting it whistle through the air. "What are you gonna do about it?" he taunted, his voice loud enough to draw attention. The guard didn't flinch. Not even a twitch. If anything, their posture seemed even steadier, radiating calm authority. Around them, the mood shifted. Some onlookers gasped, others whispered nervously, and a few pulled out their phones to record the unfolding drama. Jake basked in the sudden spotlight, enjoying the rush of adrenaline. He saw himself as untouchable, invincible, but what he didn't realize was that the guard wasn't just standing there. They were calculating, assessing, and preparing. For now, the standoff held everyone captive, a tense bubble amidst the festive atmosphere. Jake's smirk widened as he swung the chain again, this time closer to the guard. But deep down, beneath the bravado, something stirred, a flicker of doubt. What if this wasn't going to go his way? Still, he pushed the thought aside, too proud to back down. Little did he know, the next few seconds would change everything, for better or worse. The tension in the air was palpable as Jake continued to swing the metal chain, his movements growing bolder with each passing second. The royal guard, however, remained an unshakable pillar of discipline. Standing tall and unwavering, they seemed almost otherworldly in their composure. Their face betrayed no emotion, no anger, no fear, not even a flicker of irritation. It was as if Jake's taunts were nothing more than a gentle breeze brushing against a mountain. Jake, on the other hand, was feeding off the energy of the crowd. He could feel dozens of eyes glued to him, watching his every move. Some people whispered nervously, while others openly stared, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch the spectacle unfold. A few even chuckled nervously, perhaps thinking this was all some kind of act, a dare gone too far. But Jake wasn't performing for laughs. He wanted respect, or at least the illusion of it, and he believed that intimidating this guard would earn him just that. With another lazy swing of the chain, Jake stepped closer, narrowing the gap between them. "You hear me?" he shouted, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "I said move." Still, the guard didn't respond. Not a word. Not a single movement beyond the steady rise and fall of their chest as they breathed. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like the guard was frozen in time, But those who looked closely noticed something else entirely: the subtle shift in their stance. Though imperceptible to most, the guards' feet adjusted ever so slightly, spreading apart to create a firmer base. Their hands, previously resting motionless at their sides, now hovered near their waist, ready to act if needed. These were tiny details, easy to miss unless you knew what to look for. And Jake, he didn't know. All he saw was someone who refused to back down, someone who dared to ignore him. That only fueled his frustration further. "Think you're tough, huh?" Jake sneered, taking yet another step forward. His confidence swelled with each passing moment. After all, he had seen plenty of guards in movies or on TV. They were usually portrayed as stiff, ceremonial figures, more for show than anything else. How hard could it be to rattle one in real life? Surely this person would crack under pressure, maybe even step aside or call for backup. But the guard did neither. Instead, they stood there, silent and immovable, like a statue carved from granite. The crowd around them began to grow restless. Parents pulled their children closer, shielding them from what might happen next. Tourists filming the scene exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to cheer Jake on or condemn his actions. Even the distant hum of the parade music faded into the background, replaced by the heavy silence of anticipation. Every eye was fixed on the two figures locked in this bizarre standoff, one brash and unpredictable, the other calm and calculated. Jake swung the chain again, this time letting it graze the guard's chest. The metallic clink echoed loudly, breaking the quiet. For a split second, he thought he saw something change in the guard's expression, a flicker of something. Was it irritation, determination, or maybe just focus? Whatever it was, it sent a shiver down Jake's spine, though he quickly shook it off. No way was he backing down now. Not in front of all these people, not when he had come this far. But deep inside, doubt began to creep in. Why wasn't the guard reacting? Why weren't they yelling, threatening, or at least flinching? Something about their stillness felt unnatural, almost menacing. Jake tightened his grip on the chain, trying to shake off the unease building in his chest. Little did he know, the guard wasn't just standing there. They were waiting, waiting for the perfect moment to act. And when that moment came, Jake would realize far too late that he had underestimated his opponent in the worst possible way. Jake's world shifted in an instant. One moment, he was swinging the chain with all the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. The next, his wrist was caught in a grip so firm it felt like iron shackles had snapped shut around him. Before he could even process what was happening, the guard twisted his arm behind his back with practiced ease. Pain shot through Jake's shoulder, forcing him to drop the chain. It clattered loudly against the cobblestones, drawing gasps from the crowd. The transformation in Jake's demeanor was immediate. His cocky smirk vanished, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. "What the?" he stammered, his voice cracking under the strain of both pain and shock. He tried to pull away, wriggling like a fish caught on a hook, but the guard's hold didn't budge. If anything, it tightened slightly, a silent warning that further resistance would only make things worse. Jake froze, his bravado crumbling faster than he could have imagined. The crowd, which had been buzzing with nervous energy just moments before, erupted into murmurs of astonishment. Some people clapped instinctively, impressed by the guard's swift and controlled response. Others laughed nervously, shaking their heads at Jake's foolishness. Parents exchanged knowing glances, whispering to their children about why it's never a good idea to pick fights with people who clearly knew what they were doing. Even the tourists filming the scene seemed torn between concern and amusement, their phones capturing every humiliating second. For Jake, the humiliation was unbearable. Kneeling on the ground, his arm pinned behind his back, he felt smaller than he ever had in his life. Gone was the swagger, the arrogance, the illusion of invincibility. All that remained was a man who had grossly misjudged the situation, and now had to face the consequences. His mind raced as he tried to figure out how things had gone so wrong so quickly. How had this seemingly ordinary guard managed to disarm him in seconds? It didn't make sense. Nothing about this moment made sense. The guard, meanwhile, remained as composed as ever. Their actions hadn't been fueled by anger or retaliation. They were simply following protocol. Once Jake was subdued, they adjusted their stance slightly, ensuring they maintained control without applying unnecessary force. To anyone watching, it was clear that the guard wasn't punishing Jake. They were neutralizing a threat. There was no malice in their movements, only precision and professionalism. As the initial wave of panic subsided, Jake began to realize the gravity of his predicament. He was on his knees in front of hundreds of onlookers, completely at the mercy of someone he had underestimated. His earlier boasts and taunts now felt hollow, echoing mockingly in his ears. "Let me go," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. But even he knew it was too late for apologies or excuses. The damage was done. Around them, the atmosphere shifted again. What had started as a tense standoff had turned into something else entirely. A spectacle of justice served swiftly and efficiently. People began to cheer, not for Jake, but for the guard. "You showed him," one man shouted, raising his fist in approval. A woman nearby added, "Serves him right for being such an idiot." Laughter rippled through the crowd, punctuated by applause. For many, it was a satisfying conclusion to a chaotic scene. But amidst the noise and celebration, Jake's thoughts spiraled. He had always prided himself on being fearless, on living life on his own terms. Now, kneeling there with his arm twisted painfully behind him, he felt anything but fearless. Instead, he felt exposed, vulnerable, and deeply ashamed. As the guard held him firmly in place, waiting for law enforcement to arrive, Jake couldn't help but wonder, how did I let this happen? The answer, though painful, was glaringly obvious. He had let his ego get the better of him. And now, he was paying the price. Weeks later, Jake found himself standing in a courtroom, the sterile environment a far cry from the chaotic streets of London, where his ordeal had begun. The room was quiet but tense, filled with murmurs from spectators and the faint rustling of papers as lawyers prepared their arguments. Jake, dressed in a plain shirt and jeans, looked smaller than he ever had before. His usual leather jacket and sunglasses were nowhere to be seen, replaced by an air of humility that felt almost foreign on him. As he glanced around the room, he noticed reporters scribbling notes and cameras discreetly capturing the moment. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was public spectacle. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Jake's heart pounded as the charges against him were read aloud. Attempted assault on a member of the Royal Guard, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest. Each word felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. When it was his turn to speak, Jake cleared his throat nervously, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I didn't mean for things to go this far." It was the first time he'd admitted fault out loud, and though his apology lacked eloquence, it carried a sincerity that surprised even him. The prosecution didn't hold back, painting Jake as a reckless individual whose actions could have endangered innocent bystanders. They emphasized the viral nature of the incident, pointing out how his behavior had tarnished the dignity of a historic event and disrespected the institution of the Royal Guards. The defense, meanwhile, argued that Jake's actions were impulsive rather than malicious and highlighted his remorse as evidence of genuine regret. "He understands the gravity of his mistakes," Jake's lawyer stated firmly, "and he is willing to take responsibility." When the judge delivered the verdict, Jake braced himself for the worst. He was sentenced to 150 hours of community service, fined heavily, and placed on probation for 6 months. While relieved that jail time wasn't part of the ruling, Jake knew the punishment would still leave a lasting mark, not just financially, but emotionally. After the hearing ended, reporters swarmed him outside the courthouse, shouting questions about what he had learned and whether he planned to change his ways. Jake pushed past them without comment, his head bowed low. In the days that followed, Jake threw himself into fulfilling his sentence. Community service assignments ranged from cleaning parks to assisting at local shelters, tasks that forced him to interact with people who reminded him of his own mistakes. One day, while picking up trash along a busy street, a group of teenagers stopped to watch him work. "Aren't you that guy who got owned by the Royal Guard?" one of them asked, smirking. Jake winced but nodded, expecting ridicule. Instead, the teenager shrugged and said, "Man, that must have been rough. Hope you're doing better now." Surprisingly, it wasn't mockery, it was understanding. Moments like these began to shift Jake's perspective. People weren't just laughing at him. Some genuinely wanted him to grow. Jake also started reflecting on the qualities he'd underestimated in others, qualities exemplified by the guard who had subdued him. Their discipline, patience, and professionalism stuck with him long after the incident. He realized that strength wasn't about posturing or intimidation. It was about control, both over oneself and one's actions. Inspired by this revelation, Jake decided to channel his energy differently. He joined a local gym, focusing on self-improvement rather than rebellion. Slowly but surely, he began rebuilding his life, piece by piece. Though the internet hadn't forgotten about him, memes and jokes about his failed stunt continued to circulate. Jake chose not to dwell on it. Instead, he used the experience as motivation to become someone worthy of respect, not fear. By the time his community service hours were completed, he felt like a different person altogether. The cocky biker who once swung a chain at a Royal Guard was gone, replaced by a man determined to learn from his mistakes and move forward with purpose. And while the scars of humiliation remained, they served as reminders of how far he'd come and how much further he could go if he stayed true to this new path. Months passed, and Jake's life began to take on a new rhythm. The lessons he had learned from his disastrous encounter with the Royal Guard lingered in his mind, shaping every decision he made moving forward. What started as a moment of reckless arrogance had transformed into an opportunity for growth, though it hadn't been easy. Every time someone recognized him or brought up the incident, Jake felt a pang of embarrassment. But instead of letting it drag him down, he used those moments as reminders of how far he'd come. One afternoon, while volunteering at a community center, Jake found himself face to face with a group of teenagers who were part of an after-school mentorship program. They were lively and curious, peppering him with questions about his past. At first, Jake hesitated, unsure if he wanted to revisit the story that had humbled him so deeply. But then one boy, no older than 16, leaned forward and asked, "Why did you do it? What made you think swinging a chain at a guard was a good idea?" Jake chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Honestly, I wasn't thinking," he admitted. "I thought I was untouchable, like nothing could touch me. But I learned real quick that being tough isn't about throwing punches or acting big. It's about knowing when not to." He paused, looking around at the young faces staring back at him. "That day taught me something important. Actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences hit harder than you ever expect." The teenagers listened intently, their initial amusement fading into genuine interest. One girl raised her hand timidly. "What happened after? You know, everything," she asked. Jake smiled faintly, appreciating her curiosity. He explained how the court case had forced him to confront his mistakes and how community service had given him a chance to give back to people who needed help. "It wasn't fun," he said honestly, "but it changed me for the better." Word of Jake's transformation spread slowly through his community. People who once dismissed him as just another troublemaker began to see him differently. Neighbors noticed how he spent weekends cleaning up local parks, and staff at the shelter where he volunteered praised his dedication. Though some still teased him about the infamous chain incident, they did so with a playful tone, acknowledging that he had turned things around. Even online, the narrative shifted slightly. Some commenters noted his efforts to improve, adding updates to old posts about the viral video. "Maybe this guy really is learning," one wrote. "Good for him." As time went on, Jake found peace in his new routine. He continued working out at the gym, channeling his energy into healthier habits. He even started mentoring younger kids, sharing stories about his missteps and encouraging them to avoid making similar mistakes. It was strange, he thought, how something so humiliating could lead to something so meaningful. He wasn't proud of what he'd done, but he was grateful for the lessons it had taught him. One crisp autumn morning, Jake stood outside Buckingham Palace again, not as a provocateur, but as a visitor. He walked quietly among the tourists, taking in the grandeur of the building and the precision of the guards standing watch. When he spotted one of the guards, he stopped for a moment, watching silently. There was no animosity in his gaze, only respect. He didn't approach or say anything. He simply nodded to himself before walking away. Later that day, sitting on a park bench overlooking the palace grounds, Jake reflected on how much his life had changed. The cocky biker who had swung a chain in anger seemed like a distant memory now. In his place was someone wiser, humbler, and more grounded. Jake knew he couldn't erase the past, nor did he want to. Instead, he carried it with him as a reminder of the importance of humility, discipline, and self-awareness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the city, Jake smiled softly to himself. Life had thrown him a curveball, but he had caught it and turned it into something worthwhile. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace, and though the road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, he was ready to face them, not with bravado, but with quiet determination. After all, he had already proven that even the hardest lessons can lead to the greatest growth. Unbeknownst to Jake, the guard wasn't just a figurehead dressed in a striking red uniform and towering bearskin hat. Beneath that polished exterior was someone who had trained for years to handle situations exactly like this one. The royal guards weren't chosen at random. They were among the most disciplined and skilled individuals in the military, handpicked for their ability to protect, adapt, and respond with precision. And this particular guard was no exception. Long before donning the iconic uniform, they had undergone rigorous training designed to prepare them for anything, whether it was ceremonial duties or unexpected confrontations. They had learned advanced combat techniques, practiced countless drills, and honed their reflexes until every movement became second nature. Their instructors had drilled into them one core principle above all others: never let emotions dictate your actions. No matter how provocative or aggressive someone might be, the key was to remain calm, assess the situation, and neutralize any threat efficiently. Jake's antics, loud and obnoxious as they were, didn't faze the guard in the slightest. To them, Jake wasn't an intimidating opponent. He was simply a problem that needed solving. Every swing of the chain, every taunt, every step closer only served to provide more information about his intentions. The guard noticed everything. The way Jake shifted his weight when he swung the chain, the slight hesitation before stepping forward, even the uncertainty flickering in his eyes despite his bravado. These details painted a clear picture, a reckless man trying to appear fearless but lacking real control. As Jake continued to posture, the guards subtly adjusted their position. Their feet spread slightly wider, grounding them firmly against the cobblestone pavement. One hand moved fractionally closer to their utility belt, ready to act if necessary. Years of practice allowed them to make these adjustments without drawing attention. To the untrained eye, they still appeared completely still. But beneath the surface, every muscle was coiled like a spring, prepared to strike with precision. What Jake failed to understand, and what made his overconfidence so dangerous, was that the guard's silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. By remaining calm and composed, the guard forced Jake to reveal his own vulnerabilities. His swings grew wilder, less controlled. His taunts became louder, almost desperate, as though he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else that he was in charge. With each passing moment, Jake unknowingly gave away more clues about his next move, while the guard waited patiently for the right opportunity. For the crowd watching, the scene was tense but oddly mesmerizing. Some people whispered nervously, speculating about what might happen next. Others held their breath, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. But none of them, not even Jake, realized the depth of skill hidden behind the guard's stoic facade. To them, the guard was just another figure in a uniform, standing there impassively. They couldn't see the years of dedication, the countless hours spent perfecting techniques, or the razor-sharp focus guiding every decision. And then it happened. Jake lunged forward suddenly, swinging the chain with surprising speed. It was reckless, impulsive, and fueled by frustration. For a brief moment, he thought he had the upper hand. Surely, this sudden burst of aggression would catch the guard off guard. Or so he believed. What he didn't know was that the guard had already anticipated his move. As the chain arced through the air, the guard stepped aside with effortless grace, their movements fluid and precise. In one swift motion, they grabbed Jake's wrist mid-swing, twisting it just enough to force him to drop the weapon. The clatter of the chain hitting the ground echoed loudly, breaking the spell of tension that had gripped the crowd. For Jake, time seemed to slow down. One moment, he was in control, or so he thought. And the next, he was staring up at the guard, his arm twisted behind his back, his cocky grin replaced by wide-eyed shock. He hadn't seen it coming, not even close. And as the reality of the situation sank in, Jake realized too late that he had underestimated his opponent in the worst possible way. As the cheers and jeers from the crowd washed over him, Jake felt like he was sinking into a pit of embarrassment, so deep it might never end. Kneeling on the cold pavement with his arm still pinned behind his back, he could hear every insult, every sarcastic remark aimed at him. "What a loser!" someone shouted, their voice cutting through the din. Another person chimed in. "He thought he was tough. Look at him now." The words stung more than Jake cared to admit, each one landing like a punch to his already bruised ego. The guard remained silent throughout, their focus unwavering. They weren't there to shame or punish Jake. They were doing their job, ensuring the safety of everyone around them. But that didn't stop the crowd from turning on him. Strangers who had initially watched with mild curiosity were now fully invested in making sure Jake knew just how foolish he'd been. Some called him names, others mocked his leather jacket and sunglasses, and a few even mimicked his earlier taunts for dramatic effect. Phones continued to flash as people recorded the scene, capturing every moment of Jake's downfall. To make matters worse, the laughter wasn't just coming from adults. It reached the ears of children too. A group of kids standing nearby giggled uncontrollably, pointing at Jake as if he were part of some slapstick comedy show. One little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked loudly, "Why is that man kneeling like that?" The mother replied without missing a beat, "Because he did something silly and got caught." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but the implication hit Jake hard. He wasn't just being humiliated in front of strangers. He was becoming a cautionary tale for the next generation. Despite the growing chaos around him, Jake couldn't bring himself to look up. His eyes stayed glued to the ground, avoiding the sea of faces staring back at him. Every attempt to wriggle free only earned him another firm adjustment of the guard's grip, a subtle reminder that resistance was futile. The pain in his shoulder was sharp and unrelenting, but it paled in comparison to the weight of his own humiliation. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined ending up like this, on his knees, surrounded by a mocking crowd, utterly defeated. It wasn't long before the distant wail of sirens added another layer of dread to the situation. Police officers arrived quickly, pushing through the throng of onlookers to assess the scene. When they saw Jake subdued by the guard, they exchanged brief nods of approval. Clearly, the message had been sent loud and clear. No one messes with the royal guards. Two officers approached Jake, pulling out handcuffs as they knelt beside him. "You're under arrest," one of them said firmly, reading him his rights while the other took over restraining him. The transition from the guard's hold to the police officer's custody was seamless. As soon as Jake was handed off, the guard stepped back into position, resuming their role as though nothing unusual had occurred. To the public eye, they were once again an immovable figure of authority, blending seamlessly into the backdrop of Buckingham Palace. Tourists began lining up to take photos with them, eager to capture a memory with the very person who had just taken down a biker. It was surreal. Just moments ago, they had been at the center of a heated confrontation, and now they were back to business as usual. For Jake, however, there was no returning to normalcy. With his hands cuffed behind his back, he was hauled to his feet and led toward the waiting police car. The walk felt endless, each step dragging him further away from any shred of dignity he might have clung to. People booed as he passed, their voices merging into a cacophony of disapproval. Someone even threw a crumpled soda can in his direction, narrowly missing his head. Each insult, each jeer, felt like salt rubbed into an open wound. When Jake finally reached the police car, he hesitated for a split second before ducking inside. The door slammed shut behind him, muffling the noise of the crowd, but not erasing the sting of their ridicule. As the vehicle pulled away, he slumped against the seat, his mind racing. For the first time in years, Jake allowed himself to feel truly vulnerable. The bravado that had defined him for so long had evaporated, leaving behind only regret and a painful awareness of his mistakes. Outside, life went on. The parade resumed its course. The crowd dispersed, and the palace grounds returned to their usual tranquility. But for Jake, the day would linger forever, a stark reminder of what happens when arrogance meets discipline, and when recklessness crosses paths with professionalism. Back at the police station, Jake sat slumped in a cold, hard chair, his cuffed hands resting awkwardly on the table in front of him. The sterile fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his face and highlighting the dark circles under his eyes. Gone was the swaggering biker who had strutted into Buckingham Palace grounds just hours earlier. In his place was a man visibly deflated, his usual bravado replaced by a mix of exhaustion and shame. He stared blankly at the scratched surface of the table, avoiding eye contact with the officers processing his case. The room was alive with activity, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, and officers exchanging clipped conversations. But none of it registered with Jake. His mind replayed the events of the day over and over again, each memory sharper and more painful than the last. He could still hear the jeers of the crowd, see the smirks of the tourists, and feel the weight of the guards' grip as they pinned him to the ground. It was all too fresh, too raw. For someone who prided himself on being untouchable, this level of public humiliation felt unbearable. As the hours dragged on, Jake began to realize that his actions weren't just going to fade away quietly. News of the incident had spread like wildfire, thanks to social media. By the time he was booked and fingerprinted, videos of his confrontation with the royal guard were already trending online. One clip, in particular, showed him swinging the chain with exaggerated confidence, only to be disarmed within seconds. The video racked up thousands of views, comments, and shares, with users piling on the ridicule. Memes mocking his failed attempt at intimidation flooded Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Royal Guard versus Biker. Round 1 goes to discipline. Read one caption beneath a slow-motion replay of the takedown. Jake caught glimpses of these posts when an officer briefly left a computer screen unattended during the booking process. Seeing himself turned into internet fodder made his stomach churn. People weren't just laughing at him. They were tearing him apart piece by piece. Some commenters called him an idiot. Others labeled him a walking stereotype of misplaced machismo. Even worse were the memes comparing him to cartoon villains, complete with exaggerated sneers and poorly photoshopped chains. Each image drove home how foolish he must have looked to everyone watching. When the formal questioning finally began, Jake found himself struggling to explain his behavior. The detective assigned to his case, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and even sharper questions, didn't mince words. "What were you thinking?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. Her tone wasn't angry, but there was an edge to it that demanded honesty. Jake opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. How could he possibly justify lunging at a royal guard with a metal chain? Even he knew there was no excuse for what he'd done. "I don't know," he muttered eventually, staring down at his cuffed hands. "I wasn't thinking." The detective sighed, jotting something down on her notepad before continuing. "You caused a scene in front of hundreds of people, including children. You assaulted, or attempted to assault, a member of the Royal Guard. And now you're sitting here, facing charges that could land you in serious trouble. Does any of this sound worth it to you?" Jake shook his head slowly, his throat tight. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely remorseful, not just for getting caught, but for letting his temper spiral so far out of control. He thought about the crowd's laughter, the viral videos, and the way the guard had handled the entire situation with calm professionalism. They hadn't reacted with anger or aggression, even when provoked. Instead, they had acted decisively and responsibly, diffusing the situation without escalating it further. Jake couldn't help but contrast their composure with his own reckless behavior. The difference was staggering. By the time the interrogation ended, Jake's future looked bleak. He was formally charged with attempted assault, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest. The bail hearing wouldn't take place until the next morning, meaning he'd spend the night in a holding cell, a prospect that filled him with dread. As he was led away from the interview room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was paying the price not just for today's actions, but for years of unchecked arrogance. In the days that followed, news outlets picked up the story, turning it into national headlines. "Biker learns hard lesson after taking on Royal Guard," blared one tabloid cover. Another ran a feature titled "Chain Reaction: How One Man's Ego Backfired Spectacularly." Journalists dissected every detail of the incident, analyzing everything from Jake's motivations to the guard's impeccable response. To the public, Jake became a symbol of recklessness, an exa